So picture this. It's January 2017. The paint is barely dry in the new Oval Office. President Donald Trump, with all the flourish of a game show host, sits at that famous resolute desk. The cameras are flashing, a swarm of them, capturing every moment. He picks up a pen, a very official-looking pen, and with a series of confident strokes he signs Executive Order 13769. The document has a very serious title: Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States. It sounds like a movie trailer, doesn't it? But this wasn't a movie. This was real life, happening live on screens across the globe. He holds it up for everyone to see, a look of immense satisfaction on his face. And just like that, the world went, well, bananas is a word. The news cycle completely exploded. Cable news chyrons screamed in bold capital letters. News anchors suddenly looked like they needed something much stronger. Pundits were practically tripping over each other to get on air and either praise it as a bold move for national security or condemn it as a betrayal of American values. It felt like someone had flipped a switch, and suddenly the entire planet was talking about one piece of paper. The reaction wasn't just fast, it was instantaneous. The signing itself was a spectacle, a carefully choreographed piece of political theater. Trump was surrounded by his team, all nodding with grave approval. The message was clear. A new sheriff was in town. He wasn't just signing a policy, he was making a statement. This was the fulfillment of a major campaign promise, a promise that had energized his base and horrified his opponents. The act itself was over in minutes, but the shockwaves it created would ripple out for years. What followed was a global scramble. Suddenly, diplomats were on the phone, lawyers were speed-reading legal documents, and families were desperately trying to figure out what this meant for them. Did it mean their loved ones couldn't come home? Did it mean their student visas were now worthless? The order was signed on a Friday afternoon, and it sent the world into a weekend of chaos and uncertainty. The stroke of that pen wasn't just a signature, it was the starting pistol for a massive, messy, and deeply emotional public debate. The quiet formality of the Oval Office was immediately contrasted by a roar of global reaction. Alright, let's break this down. What did this executive order, this travel ban, actually do? In simple terms, it slammed the door shut, at least temporarily. For 90 days, it banned citizens from 7 specific countries from entering the United States. It didn't matter if you had a valid visa you'd been waiting years for, if you were a student accepted into a top university, or a doctor coming to work at a hospital. If your passport was from one of these countries, the door was closed. The list of countries was Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. The administration's logic was that these nations were hotspots for terrorism, and their vetting processes weren't good enough for American standards. It was presented as a pause, a timeout to figure out a better system. The official reasoning, as stated by the Trump administration, was all about one thing: security. The argument was that the United States had a leaky immigration system that could be exploited by terrorists. They painted a picture of a dangerous world where threats could slip through the cracks at any moment. This ban, they claimed, was a necessary measure to protect American citizens. It was a temporary halt to allow government agencies like the Department of Homeland Security to review and strengthen the screening procedures for refugees and visa applicants from these specific regions. The goal, they said, was to create a system of extreme vetting to ensure that anyone entering the country did not pose a threat. It was a simple, powerful message: America first, safety first. But here's where it got really complicated. The order also indefinitely suspended the entry of all Syrian refugees, citing the humanitarian crisis as a potential Trojan horse for bad actors. And for 120 days, it paused the entire U.S. refugee program from all countries. Critics immediately pointed out that the 7 countries on the list were all predominantly Muslim. This led to accusations that it wasn't a travel ban at all, but a Muslim ban in disguise, fulfilling another one of Trump's most controversial campaign promises. The administration fiercely denied this, insisting the selection was based on security risks identified by the previous Obama administration, not on religion. However, the perception stuck, fueling a firestorm of criticism both at home and abroad. The list of countries itself became a major point of contention. People quickly noticed that some countries with known ties to terrorism, like Saudi Arabia, where most of the 9/11 hijackers were from, were not on the list. Coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, these were also countries where Donald Trump had significant business interests. This observation added fuel to the argument that the ban was not a carefully crafted security policy, but a piece of political posturing that was both discriminatory and arbitrary. So, while the official line was a clear-cut story about national security, the details and omissions created a much murkier and more contentious reality for everyone trying to make sense of it. The ink on the executive order was barely dry when the chaos began. It was like a scene from a disaster movie, but the disaster was bureaucratic. All across the country, at major international airports from JFK in New York to LAX in Los Angeles, confusion reigned supreme. Customs and Border Protection officers on the ground seemed to be just as confused as everyone else. They were receiving orders from Washington, but the guidelines were unclear and seemed to be changing by the hour. Travelers who had been in the air when the order was signed landed to find out they were no longer welcome. They were barred from entering the country they had a legal right to visit just hours before. Imagine the scene. Families waiting anxiously at arrival gates, holding welcome signs and balloons, only to be told their loved ones were being detained or put on the next flight back. There were heartbreaking stories of parents separated from their children, spouses unable to reunite, and students whose dreams of an American education were suddenly shattered. An elderly couple flying in for a medical procedure, a researcher on their way to a conference, a translator who had risked his life working for the US military in Iraq, all were caught in this sudden, bewildering net. Lawyers rushed to airports, setting up makeshift legal clinics on terminal floors, trying to get information and provide help to those being held. The human cost was immediate and devastating. We heard stories of a PhD student from Stanford University who was handcuffed and detained for hours. We heard about a 5-year-old boy, an American citizen, who was separated from his Iranian mother and held alone at Dulles Airport. These weren't abstract policy debates anymore. These were real people, with real lives, caught in a legal and emotional limbo. The airports, usually places of happy reunions and exciting departures, transformed into zones of protest, tears, and desperation. The confusion extended even to green card holders, legal permanent residents of the United States, who were initially told the ban applied to them too, before the White House later walked that back. This chaos wasn't just a side effect. For many, it seemed to be a defining feature of the policy's rollout. The lack of clear guidance and preparation created a situation where fear and uncertainty flourished. It felt less like a well-thought-out security measure and more like a switch had been flipped without anyone checking to see what it was connected to. The emotional toll on families was immense, as they were left to navigate a nightmare of bureaucracy with little to no information. The scenes broadcast from airports around the nation showed a country in turmoil, grappling with the real-world consequences of a decision made in the highest office of the land. The response to the airport chaos wasn't just confusion and tears, it was anger, and that anger spilled out into the streets almost immediately. Within 24 hours of the travel ban being signed, spontaneous protests erupted at airports all over the United States. Thousands of people from all walks of life dropped what they were doing and flocked to their nearest international terminal. They came armed with handmade signs that read, "No ban, no wall, refugees welcome, and let them in." They chanted and sang, creating a powerful chorus of dissent that echoed through the arrival halls. It was a remarkable grassroots mobilization, driven by social media and a shared sense of outrage. This wasn't just a few scattered demonstrations, it was a massive nationwide movement. In New York, the protest at JFK Airport swelled so large it shut down traffic. In Chicago, lawyers and activists filled O'Hare. In Seattle, Denver, Dallas, and Atlanta, the story was the same. People who had never protested before found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with seasoned activists. The crowds were diverse, a mix of ages, races, and religions, all united by a common belief that the policy was fundamentally un-American. The iconic image of the Statue of Liberty, a symbol of welcome for immigrants, was everywhere, on signs, on t-shirts, and in speeches. The protests showed a powerful, emotional defense of what many saw as the country's core values. The outrage quickly went global. Leaders from allied nations like Germany's Angela Merkel and Canada's Justin Trudeau voiced their concerns and criticisms. Trudeau famously tweeted, To those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you, regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. Welcome to Canada, which was seen as a direct rebuke to Trump's policy. Major international organizations, including the United Nations, condemned the ban as discriminatory and a violation of international law. The story dominated headlines around the world, painting a picture of an America turning its back on its long-standing role as a haven for the oppressed and a leader on the world stage. And of course, Hollywood and the celebrity world got involved. At the Screen Actors Guild Awards, which took place just 2 days after the ban was signed, speaker after speaker used their platform to denounce the policy. Stars like Ashton Kutcher, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and Mahershala Ali shared personal stories of their own families' immigrant backgrounds and called for compassion and resistance. This celebrity involvement amplified the message, bringing the protest movement into the living rooms of millions of Americans who might not have been following the political news so closely. It turned a complex policy debate into a major cultural moment where silence was seen by many as complicity. On one side of this fierce debate, you had the supporters of the travel ban. For them, this wasn't about discrimination, it was about common-sense national security. They pointed to terrorist attacks in Europe, like those in Paris and Brussels, as evidence that Western nations needed to be more careful about who they let in. The argument was simple and powerful. The government's #1 job is to protect its own citizens. If that meant temporarily pausing immigration from a handful of countries with known terrorist activity and unstable governments, then it was a small price to pay for safety. They saw the ban not as a wall, but as a necessary security fence while the guards checked for holes. These supporters often felt that the mainstream media and liberal critics were deliberately misrepresenting the policy. They would emphasize the word temporary and argue that calling it a Muslim ban was a political smear. They pointed out that many Muslim-majority countries were not on the list, including the most populous ones like Indonesia and Pakistan. For them, this was proof that the policy was based on geography and security risk, not religion. They saw President Trump as a leader who was finally willing to take bold, decisive action to secure the nation's borders, something they felt previous administrations had failed to do. In their view, the outrage was just political correctness gone wild, and that the safety of Americans should always trump feelings. On the other side, the critics were just as passionate. They argued that the ban was not only immoral, but also ineffective as a security measure. They pointed out that no person from any of the 7 targeted countries had ever committed a fatal terrorist act on U.S. soil. The policy, they said, was based on fear, not facts. It was seen as a cruel and blunt instrument that punished innocent people, damaged America's reputation abroad, and was a gift to terrorist recruiters who could use it as propaganda to say the West was at war with Islam. This side argued that the existing vetting process for refugees was already incredibly stringent, often taking years to complete. For these critics, the travel ban was the very definition of discrimination. They saw it as a thinly veiled attempt to make good on Trump's campaign promise for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. The inclusion of a provision to prioritize refugee claims from religious minorities was seen as further proof of its discriminatory intent. They argued that it violated the core American principles of religious freedom and equal protection under the law. This wasn't just bad policy, they claimed. It was a betrayal of the American ideal, the promise engraved on the Statue of Liberty to welcome the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The nation was truly split, with 2 sides seeing the exact same policy in completely opposite ways. As protesters filled the airports, lawyers were already filing lawsuits. The legal battle against the travel ban began almost as soon as it was signed, and it was intense. The American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, and other civil rights groups challenged the executive order in federal courts across the country. Their main argument was that the ban was unconstitutional because it discriminated against people based on their national origin and religion, violating the First Amendment's Establishment Clause and the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of equal protection. They also argued that it violated existing immigration laws passed by Congress. It was a full-frontal legal assault on the president's authority. The first few rounds in court went against the administration. In a dramatic turn of events, a federal judge in Seattle, Washington, issued a temporary restraining order that blocked the entire ban nationwide. This ruling was a huge victory for the opponents of the ban. Suddenly, people who had been turned away were allowed to board planes and enter the country. The Trump administration immediately appealed, but a three-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the suspension. The court questioned the government's argument that the ban was necessary for national security, noting the lack of evidence connecting anyone from the 7 countries to terrorism in the U.S. This legal back and forth created even more confusion and whiplash for travelers. In response to these legal defeats, the Trump administration didn't give up. Instead, they went back to the drawing board. They issued a revised, narrower version of the travel ban, and then a third version after that. Each new version was an attempt to make the policy more legally sound and able to withstand court scrutiny. The second version removed Iraq from the list and clarified that green card holders were not affected. The third version, issued as a presidential proclamation, was more tailored, placing varying restrictions on a new list of countries, which now included non-Muslim majority nations like North Korea and Venezuela, in an apparent attempt to counter the Muslim ban argument. Ultimately, this epic legal fight made its way to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. In June 2018, in a landmark 5-4 decision in the case Trump v. Hawaii, the Supreme Court upheld the third version of the travel ban. The majority opinion, written by Chief Justice John Roberts, argued that the president has broad authority over immigration and national security. The court found that the proclamation was expressly premised on national security concerns and that the president had lawfully exercised his authority, while the dissenters, led by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, argued that it was still a discriminatory policy, echoing the dark history of Japanese-American internment. The majority ruling gave the administration the legal victory it had fought so hard for. The ban, in its final form, was allowed to stand, ending a dramatic 18-month legal saga, but leaving the deep national debate about security, immigration, and American identity far from resolved. What do you think? Was it a necessary shield or a discriminatory stain? The debate continues.